I want to start this review by stating that I never really got far into the original Daymare 1998. I found it overall really unpolished and undercooked with its janky anime design, slow animations, and general lack of attention of detail. Although, at the same time, it was also a game that captivated me as it clearly had a unique vision and one that had a lot of untapped potential. For example, I love the fact that we're not playing as the good guys here. Most survival horror games make you play as either the bringer of peace or a victim trying to get away from it all. Rarely are we there to do the opposite, which is made clear by us murdering the first survivor we found in the facility. It's an interesting premise which goes against the cliches of the genre, which I really think it's cool overall. The same thing can be said to its most unique gameplay mechanic, which is the whole reload system. You can either reload slowly by holding the button until the animation is complete, or you can rapidly press it in order to execute a fast but loose reload system. The difference between both is that the game doesn't refill the ammunition automatically when you reload like in every other game in the market. If you reload rapidly, you essentially drop the magazine with whatever number of bullets is inside in favor of a new mag that you prepare beforehand. The plus side of this method is that you get to adapt rapidly to your surroundings and get to immediately continue your assault. The downside is that you also lost all leftover ammunition in favor of a new magazine. The alternative to this is to hold the button instead, which is considerably slower, forcing you to constantly decide which is more appropriate for every given situation. It's an interesting mechanic for sure, which brings something new to the survival horror genre and therefore feels unique when compared to its counterparts. Unfortunately, the setbacks that this system creates is also its greatest downfall. For example, you have to constantly pull out your inventory menu, which is slow, in order to manually refill your mag with bullets, which is even slower. Combat also doesn't feel as polished as it should be, so it can feel very gimmicky and experimental, which is then brought to another level of frustration when you add in a reload system that goes against your years of accumulated muscle memory. All combined, it creates a game that feels innovative and unique, but ultimately suffers from its own ambitions. That's not to say that the game isn't worth checking out though, as I can totally see someone getting over all of its faults in order to enjoy the things that it does right. For me, on the other hand, I simply couldn't get over that level, and it's for those reasons that I got really excited to play the sequel. I thought that making a sequel would allow the development team to fix what worked while adding into it in significant ways. I honestly don't think that it could have been so hard to do. I mean, make the reload system less of a chore while tightening its combat as much as possible, add in more enemy design, and vary the environment a little more, and I think that it would have done actually something genuinely awesome. Which is why I'm forced to burst your bubble and state that not only does this game ditch its predecessor, it completely goes in another direction entirely. It removed the reload system, simplified its puzzles drastically while lowering the need to manage your inventory in order to prioritize a significantly more fast-paced and action-oriented combat. I wouldn't mind this change at all if it was executed well, but unfortunately, the combat is seriously undercooked, lacks animations, is extremely repetitive in every sense of the word, and so much more. Combined with its mediocre voice acting, cutscene glitches, and low textures that rival the guns in Borderlands, and you end up with a game that takes one step forward and multiple steps backward all at the same time. Right from the start, the game doesn't hide its lack of polish. The first cutscene has a bunch of low textures, weird character animations, frequent frame drops, and okay voice acting. Weirdly enough though, it actually gets worse with every subsequent cutscene that follows, with weird frame glitches between cuts, inconsistent lip syncing, and hair that seems to have developed its own AI. Additionally, when roaming around the starting area, you will also find a few levitating characters, doors that took a page from Mjolnir, and only fully opens for worthy people, which obviously isn't you, and more. It honestly leaves a lot to be desired, but on the plus side, it foreshadows the general quality of the game. It gets you ready for what's ahead, and I think that it's acceptable when considering its price tag. $40 on release or $50 for the physical copy makes me more forgiving for these things than its counterpart. I'm looking at you, Gollum. Plus, I'm ready to cut them some slack because none of these really affect the way that I play the game. When you're not watching a cutscene, the frame rate is stable with no glitches or pop-in of any kind plaguing the environment. The game also never crashed or caused me any technical issues, so overall, it actually runs pretty well. Although, there were two aspects that genuinely affected my overall immersion, with the first one being the constant and seemingly random use of low textures and a usually detailed layout. Daymare isn't a looker in any sense of the word. Its environments are repetitive, dark, and overall uninspired. While writing reading the script for this video, I genuinely can't remember a single location that I found memorable or noteworthy in any way. They all just blend together as they all have a similar tone, color palette, and sense of linearity. Although, one positive thing is that they're generally detailed, which in turn makes the low quality texture stick out in the environment like a Teletubbies trying to play hide and seek. I've honestly not seen it done to this extent in a very long time, making me genuinely wonder if it's an optimization problem to PS5, or if they genuinely thought that no one would notice. The same mentality can be applied with its overall low animation quality. Running and switching weapons, for example, feels off and not as fluent as it should be. The same feeling also applies to the mouth movements during dialogue and the general way that the characters behave during most cutscenes. To make matters worse, the game either has a small variety and similar and repetitive animations, or straight up is lacking animations for very specific actions. When upgrading your items, for example, you select it and it just happens off screen for some reason, downplaying an upgrade system that already feels bare bones to say the least. Also, using a medkit and other items are instantaneous and just a press away, which was weird considering that the core gameplay philosophy of the original game was the exact opposite. I'll also talk more about this subject when I get in my combat analysis, so just know that, all in all, I would say that the general presentation of this game is nothing more than serviceable. It gets the job done and it doesn't really strive to be anything more than that, even if it can get very repetitive in the long run. Interestingly enough, that's also exactly how I would describe the little that this game has to offer in terms of story. Daymare 1994 does indeed have a complete narrative that contains some interesting ideas for sure, but those moments are few and far between as the devs are more interested in having you execute its combat system than having you experience a unique and worthwhile narrative. The game starts off as you might expect. A top-secret research center has gone silent after an unspecified event murdered a bunch of civilians. A squad called Section 8 has also been sent to investigate the situation, but ended up also going MIA, which is where we come in. We and two other colleagues are therefore sent on location in order to figure out what happened and to, more importantly, extract a briefcase which holds top-secret documents related to the experiments being conducted on the site. One helicopter ride later, we discover that the whole research center is abandoned and under some form of security lockdown, as with the communication and electronic expert of the team were ordered to split up in order to find a way to unlock the facility. As always with these kinds of games, the other team gets wounded off screen once the lockdown is lifted, making it our job to complete the mission and figure out what the hell is happening, and honestly, that's about it when it comes to most of the game. Most cutscenes before this point serve to build up the relationship between Dahlia Reyes, our playable character, and the other two generic soldiers that come along for the ride. You have Ivan Radek, who's an arrogant soldier that keeps degrading us at every chance he gets. A lot of screen time is dedicated to him with the goal of showing the bond that both characters already have in order to make our decision to protect him when wounded that much more impactful. Obviously, it doesn't really work as it happens after playing for about an hour and a half, but I do appreciate the attempt. The second character is Mark Foster. He's in charge of the mission and the one guiding the team through the research center until he gets separated and his walkie-talkie stops functioning. His disappearance is made to create tension for us as we explore the deserted facility in search of the briefcase, but it falls flat as he barely shows up in the game. To be more precise, starting chapter 4, we won't get any cutscenes or news from both of them until the end of chapter 8. Also, those 4 chapters in between are exponentially longer than its predecessors, so I honestly had forgotten that those characters were actually even in the game. They're barely mentioned once the shit hits the fan, and the story is at the standstill until it no longer isn't. Most of the time, it feels like you're there by yourself trying to complete the fetch quest, which it basically is. Get to the facility, find the briefcase, and call for extraction. It's only at the end of chapter 8 that we get a huge exposition dump that explains in detail why we're actually there and what this facility is before asking us to modify our protocol and proceed to the new mission. The reveal isn't really all that surprising, but I don't think that it was meant to be anything else but the basic motivation to move forward with the plot. You may think that I'm making it sound negative, but I think that it actually is a mixed bag overall. When you play a survival horror game, whether it be the old school Resident Evil, Signalis, Tormented Souls, or more, they usually give a limited amount of context at the beginning in order to get us started with the quest. This usually happens because we find ourselves in an area that we simply aren't familiar with, and it's by unveiling its secrets that we get engaged with its world building and general narrative. The problem with this game is that it isn't clever enough to build an intuitive narrative and therefore favors periodically basically long-term exposition dumps. Actually, Daymare 1994 was quite formulaic in its storytelling. Once you've discovered the enemies of the game, which I'll touch on shortly, you'll soon get the scene that explains why you're doing everything alone. A little later, we get a short villain speech before disappearing with a similar speech given later on, but this time, it's done in person through plexiglass because, well, of course it is. Then, we get the first big reveal, but it's cut short for story purposes, which then forces us again to move on alone once more. Plus, the only true world building that the game offers is through text logs that you find scattered all over the game, but they rarely end up being relevant to what we actually have to do. At best, they give us some lore on an object located in the same room as us, and at worst, it's just someone complaining about something that is completely irrelevant to our cause. It's basically nothing new, and I doubt that anyone will remember the game for its story, which is a shame because it has one truly unique thing that separates it from the rest of the genre. I genuinely love the concept behind the enemy design. The idea is that a mysterious ball of energy has magically appeared in the facility, and once it penetrates a corpse, it reanimates it while turning it into a feral zombie. It's intriguing because you find yourself in a super secret research base, and seeing such a weird phenomenon just adds more captivating questions on top of the already mysterious narrative. It's definitely a cool way of merging the lore and the gameplay together in a way that makes sense, so it surely is the strongest point in the world building by far. My main issue with it is that it doesn't feel like the devs wanted to explore it more until it was mandatory for the story. You won't find any documentation that will help you guess what it is, for example. You just kill a small army for them until you get a cutscene explaining what you were killing all along. Plus, this is more of a pet peeve, but the main collectibles in the game sort of spoil it a little too much in my opinion, but it can't really be anything else, so it is what it is, I guess. To be fair though, the story does get better in the last third of the game as it puts a bigger emphasis on the story while bringing some definitely interesting ideas on the table. It does indeed partially redeem itself at the very end, and I will certainly give it some credit for it, but unfortunately, it's just not enough for me to recommend that you play it just to get to that point, as other games have executed these same ideas in a much more effective and satisfying way. Lastly, there are a few other things that don't make sense to me, like this game is happening in the past but we're killing blue orbs in a high-tech lab with a freeze gun that just couldn't exist in the past. Like, the prequel is more technologically advanced than the first game, which creates a continuity error if you ask me. If the argument is that it feels like one of those future reimagining movies made in the 90s, then it would actually work as a standalone title, but not as a prequel to a more grounded and modern feeling game. Still, it's nothing that detracts from the global experience, but I felt like mentioning it as the talk kept popping up constantly when playing the game. At the end of it all, I can give the story a pass because it's not really the main focus of this 6-hour-long game. I'm sure that most people didn't expect it to have an epic story to begin with. All you probably want to know is how fun it is to kill stuff, how scary it is, and is it as gimmicky as it sounds when considering that corpses get reanimated all the time? And the answer is actually quite simple. It fucking sucks! Paper, the combat's really unique and innovative, which it definitely is. Any corpse lying around can potentially become a moving target, so it can create tension when you enter a new room and find a bunch of them scattered on the floor. Then, once the blue orb appears and reanimates one of them, your instinct will be to immediately shoot it down with either your shotgun or machine gun, as this game only has 2 traditional weapons to offer. Although, doing it this way will use too many bullets, so you're therefore naturally enticed to use the new weapon that was added in the game, called the Frost Grip. This experimental gadget uses the liquid nitrogen located on your backpack in order to slow down or even freeze any enemies that come in contact with your projectile. The more an enemy is frozen, the more damage each bullet does to it. Plus, when an enemy is completely frozen, you can then get close to it and execute a takedown, which shatters the enemy on impact, saving you bullets at the same time. Plus, when 2 blue orbs fuse together in the same enemy, it turns red, signifying that it's resistant to your ammunition, and therefore only freezing it completely will allow you to get rid of it. You can therefore imagine just how many moment-to-moment decisions the player must take during each combat sequence when you have to manage your health, ammunition count, and your freeze rate. Also, to make matters worse, the Frost Grip is also on a cooldown, which recharges over time, so you have to really manage your options constantly and try to always have some juice left, as it's probably the only thing that will make the difference during a life or death situation. On top of all that, the devs decide to streamline the controls by removing the reload system from the original, making the medkits instantaneous, and lastly, streamlining the inventory system in favor of a more typical layout like those found in the Resident Evil or Dead Space games. All these improvements do sound awesome, and in real world they actually would be, but the problem is that they never really come together harmoniously. Take the main enemy for example, which looks like a skinny blue zombie type thing. These blue guys charge towards you mostly in a straight line, rarely avoiding attacks, and are about 2 or 3 times faster than you in every possible way. The game also doesn't come with a run function, so they will inevitably reach you and attempt to grapple you. If they succeed, which they mostly will, as the hitbox isn't as well designed as it should be, you get sucked into a QTE animation while they drain your health at a ridiculous rate. Also, I hope that you like this animation because it's the only attack that they have in the whole game. They cannot melee you, throw projectiles, block, or anything else really. That ultimately means that anytime you get attacked, no matter if it's from behind or from one of your sides, you will always appear in front of them and lose about 20 to 25% of your health. Plus, as you know already, shooting them down takes too many bullets, so your best option is to freeze them before taking them down. It takes 2 freezing bullets before they completely stop, which is reasonable, but the problem is that you can't shoot your freeze ray multiple times in a row. There's a 3 to 4 second delay before you can shoot it again, so often enough, you will shoot one freezing bullet and it will keep going towards you, grab you, and by the time you finish the animation, it will have unfrozen completely. Plus, it is rarely alone, so if you shoot one and get grappled, your progress will be lost and you'll be back to square one. To make matters even worse, your frost grip recharges slower than any other attack or animation, which means that you will often end up waiting for it because you got stun locked and used it all in order to create some distance. There are also 2 things that I failed to mention, with the first one being that once you've done with the QTE segment, you may use a lot of your liquid nitrogen in order to freeze the ground around you and to slow down any enemies in your proximity. The problem with this move is that it uses a lot of your energy, doesn't freeze the enemies completely, leaves you open to more groping, and you may miss some enemies to begin with because you were too far away. Also, they unfreeze pretty fast as well, and I can't tell you how many times I activated the move, realized I'd used up all of my energy only for the enemies to unfreeze before I can put any significant amount of bullets into them. To be fair though, the devs do offer an item to mitigate this effect, and it's by offering a consumable that instantaneously refills the frost system. The problem is that those items are quite rare and there's no crafting or shop system in the game, so I ended up using them only in extreme situations. Lastly, there aren't any melee attacks in the game other than the one that you can execute when the enemy is completely frozen, and guess what? The attack also uses your freeze energy, so you will basically avoid executing it as your survival basically depends on this badly implemented gimmick. Now, you might be thinking that this problem gets alleviated later on by the player getting used to the whole combat mechanics and by upgrades that you can buy, but honestly, it just gets more frustrating from here. In this scene, for example, I have an upgrade that makes the bar recharge faster and another one which allows me to contain a higher amount, and look at just how slow it recharges. Imagine just how frustrating it becomes when you get stuck with a red enemy or more, and you have to run around in circles until the bar recharges to the point that you think you have enough juice to make a difference. Worse still, if you end up being wrong, you'll end up having to redo the whole process again. These blue buffoons appear in every single combat encounter, and the pattern never changes, so you'll get sick of them really fast. Once you do kill an enemy, the blue orb comes out of it and you need to shoot a freezing projectile on it in order to finally kill it. Miss your shot, or more probable, you simply can't shoot it because you no longer have any freezing energy, and it will either reanimate another body or will turn one of the remaining enemies into another red monstrosity. By the way, speaking of annoying enemies that outstay their welcome fast, there's a new enemy that appears around the middle part of the game. They essentially teleport around the map and throw a ranged projectile that explodes on impact before repeating the process, which is cool because it finally brings some variety to the game. By this point, you probably spent like 3 hours killing the only enemy type that the game has to offer, so it's a breath of fresh air to say the least. Although, they can certainly become annoying fast as they're never alone and therefore targets you at their leisure as the basic enemies body block you in the corner. This is easily manageable as they mostly keep their distance and it doesn't take too much to kill them. When they're red, on the other hand, you'll have no choice but to keep them for last as it never charges you and requires way too much frost energy in order to get rid of it. Plus, its attacks are easily avoidable, so again, your main preoccupation will be the basic enemy type. Once everyone is dead, all you have to do is move slightly from one side to another in order to avoid its attacks and patiently wait for the frost grip to recharge. So please take a look at this footage and tell me that this is well implemented. There's also one one last enemy that I want to talk about, and I kept it for last as I find it to be the most broken of the bunch. This thing is first treated as a mini-boss, but does become a regular enemy later on. His gimmick is quite simple. He teleports around the room and can create those blue orbs at will. That means that he has the power to buff all enemies and to reanimate any deceased bodies if not dealt with fast enough. This monster, taken separately, like in the big open space where you fight him for the first time, is pretty challenging and well balanced, I would say. You have a lot of room to move, search for him, and if you don't shoot down his blue orb, he will reanimate a body, which is a nice cause and effect for fucking up. Now, I want to walk you through a battle that pissed me off so badly that I almost rage quit after my 15th attempt. You jog to this corridor-like area, and he spawns immediately with a few of those annoying blue enemies. You now have to make a tough decision. Will you tank through multiple grappling animations in order to murder it as fast as possible, or will you try to rapidly kill these abusers, hoping that you get to the big one fast enough? None of these options are actually good and viable choices because he will still take a lot of bullets to kill and will inevitably spawn a lot of new enemies by the time you even get to him. Plus, that projectile monster from before will always spawn after a while and will add to the fucking shitfest that is this hectic battle system. Add in one or even multiple red enemies and you end up in a situation where you just aren't equipped for the drama that's happening on screen. You know what's even worse? The big one can also teleport next to you when you least expect it, and he one-shot kills you no matter how much health you have left. So just as a quick recap, you get attacked by 3 enemy types in this one battle. You have the gropers that charge you, are faster than you, and will stun lock you if you aren't lucky, which can happen as you're stuck in a small and linear corridor. You also have the fatties that throw its area affecting projectiles, which often end up red for some reason, and you have a spongy asshole that can reanimate corpses, turn vulnerable enemies into invulnerable ones, and can teleport around the map, which can lead to you dying in an unfair one-shot kill animation. Oh, did I mention that you also can't run past all of them even if you wanted to, as the game blocks the exit with a wall that magically evaporates once everyone's dead? What the fuck were they thinking? Lastly, I want to spoil the real boss of the game because I almost gave up on it then and there. I'll try to keep the spoilers at a minimum as my goal is to talk about the gameplay mechanics and nothing more, which means that if you don't mind minor spoilers and want me to save you a future headache, then I would recommend that you watch what follows next. If, on the other hand, you do decide to play this game and don't want spoilers, I would recommend that you don't finish the game and only play it as long as you're enjoying yourself. Here's the timestamp for those that actually need it, and for the rest of us, here's a little bit of context on the battle. Once you've discovered what the facility is actually for and you've uncovered the source of all the madness, you get to face the resurrected corpse of one of your colleagues. At the same time, the facility is collapsing, so we're supposed to get to the extraction point as fast as possible while taking care of the problem with haste. On paper, this is supposed to be a gimmick boss that adds in so much more needed variety while considerably upping the stakes. You're essentially supposed to use your new upgrade that the game gave you a few minutes before in order to keep it away from you, creating some much needed distance while you unlock a door or slowly get away from it as it charges towards you relentlessly. If you fail and she grapples you, you get teleported to the beginning of one of the 3 fairly similar but ultimately different paths in order to try it again, and honestly, I just can't tell you how much I hate this idea. The boss teleports around you in an unpredictable way before dashing towards you when you least expect it. When it grapples you, you lose health and then get teleported to another area. What I also find stupid is that your character refuses to attack it with its fists. This is sort of explained with context that I've purposefully not added in this video, but the idea is that she cares for this person and therefore doesn't want to hurt it more than she has to. My point is that it doesn't make any sense because I'm shooting it with everything that I've got and you don't hear her complaining about it, which can also be said about the boss itself. In other words, when Reyes gets grappled, we get pissed off at her as it's her lack of initiative that allows the boss to teleport us to the start, making this whole segment even more repetitive and tedious than the rest of the game. Imagine having to walk through the same tunnel again, only to then get grappled rapidly and having to restart the whole segment again and again and again, just because Reyes felt like giving it a hug instead of beating it. Again! To make matters worse, it's not really clear what you're supposed to do in order to get past this point. You'll instinctively try killing it at first because that's all the game taught us so far and fail. You'll obviously keep at it until you finally give up and try another approach. You'll therefore try to do the opposite and start avoiding it, which will also inevitably fail as its teleporting skills are off the charts. Then, you'll go into the achievements and discover that there's indeed one for killing it, so you'll go back to the first area and try your luck, which will also inevitably fail. It was honestly at this point that I just gave up and I went online, only to discover that you're actually supposed to avoid it at all costs. The devs want you to shoot your laser in the direction of the boss, regardless if it's visible or not, as it's the only time that being invisible makes it invulnerable to your attacks. At the same time, you're supposed to pray and hope that you get lucky enough to cause enough damage that it stops attacking you and disappears. It genuinely took me 30 minutes to get past this point, which is insane as it's honestly honestly a really short segment once you take the time to reflect on what you actually did. To top it all off, your extraction team will also keep calling you on the walkie-talkie, pressuring you to get out of there as fast as possible. Although, the irony is that it required so many tries that they simply stopped calling me. Even they realized that I couldn't get there on time, so they just casually waited for me to get my shit together, as the urgency of the situation ended up being all talk and no bite. Now, you might be thinking how we're actually supposed to kill her if the whole point is to avoid her as much as possible, and the answer is quite simple. She ends up dying in a cutscene. All these things lead me to believe that this isn't a survival horror as advertised by the developers. It's a poorly designed action game because it fails in all three aspects that define the genre. First of all, there's no inventory management. The game showers you in resources to the point that I ended up with like 6 medkits and 100+ bullets for my machine gun, only to then have you revisit those locations, swarm you with unavoidable enemies without adding any additional resources. At no point did I have to make the tough decision between getting rid of a useful item for something else or to just not grab it in the first place. You might as well not have an inventory at this point, which is saying much as the game had a bigger emphasis on it in the original. Secondly, the puzzles are extremely simple and rarely require any thought. You either have to press the same combination of numbers seen on the adjacent screen, shoot your liquid nitrogen at the problem until it freezes with no variation on it whatsoever, and in more demanding cases, have to decide what path each item needs to take in order for all of them to be connected with no lines being intertwined. When I think about old survival horror games, I think of the challenging puzzles of Silent Hill or the ludicrous amount of puzzles and items found in the Resident Evils. I also think of how I had to reflect on what I had to do in Fatal Frame, or how I had to get to an area while avoiding the dinosaurs in Dino Crisis. On the other side of the spectrum, you also have games like Evil Within or Remother Tormented Fathers, where the puzzle is piecing together what the story is, and it's the newfound knowledge that rewards you for your efforts. Daymare 1994 fails in all of these aspects. Puzzles are rare and just an afterthought. The game doesn't give you enough in order to create your own narrative in your mind, while giving you an ending that does the job. On top of it all, the last thing that you need in a survival horror game is horror itself. Daymare isn't scary because it never really attempts it. You're not afraid of what's going to appear next because you know that it's always going to be another generic blue zombie guy with maybe something else with him. The environment is also generic and doesn't really stimulate the imagination of the player. The story also isn't scary because you play as a slow but badass lady that has survived a colossal amount of enemies by the end of the game. She also looks too militarized and over-sexualized for us to question her abilities, unlike what the game wants us to think. Take Isaac from Dead Space for example. We're worried for him at the start of the game because we can sense his vulnerability. He's an engineer by profession, so he starts with no armor or weapons, therefore forcing him to run away from enemies when his military co-workers get massacred immediately after arriving on the site. Then, as the game goes on, he's forced to fend for himself, acquire some basic weapons which need upgrading, and install armor upgrades which aren't complete to remind us of just how unprepared he is. You also have Tormented Souls that puts us in the shoes of a seductive but frail girl whose introduction is her naked in the tub with a tube down her throat and a missing eye to boot. Even if she starts killing a bunch of enemies after this point, we're reminded of her vulnerable state every time we look at her, and that creates a desire in the player to get her to safety. Reyes never gets close to creating that kind of vibe. She's a trained electronic expert who happens to be an excellent soldier. Every problem is tackled head first, succeeded in the first try, and even if both colleagues treat her like a no-good rookie, she immediately proves them wrong by not getting damaged after a few minutes in the complex, which makes her the ultimate Rambo offspring. All of that combined, I'm left in a bit of a predicament as to whether I should recommend this game or not. You see, when I review a game, one of my main criteria is that I need to be able to recommend the game to someone over another game. I can see it happening here because I do genuinely love the idea of corpses coming back to life, and it's the player's skill that determines how long the whole process lasts. Plus, freezing them in order to make them vulnerable is a really good idea. It's genuinely intriguing and original, which isn't something that I can say for most games that got released this year. Additionally, the game ran well and the price tag is slightly overpriced, but not enough for me to complain about it, unlike Lord of the Rings Gollum for example. On the other hand though, I also can't deny that I wouldn't have finished it if I wasn't planning on making a review, which is the same verdict that I would give to the little that I played for the first game. That's why, after thinking about it some more and rewriting this part of the script multiple times, I got to the following verdict. If you're someone who's who's constantly looking for innovations, doesn't mind not finishing a game because he values his curiosity more, and doesn't mind going through some underbaked mechanics, then I can see you having a kick out of this. Overall, I would say that this game was made to serve a specific niche, and those getting it generally know what they're getting themselves into. For the global population, however, it doesn't do nearly enough to change the narrative, so I would recommend that you don't spend your money on it. Instead, go buy another real survival horror game, as the scariest thing in this game is seeing those blue zombies arrive, and know that your frost grip wouldn't have enough juice to do the job. And with all that said, I thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it interesting and intriguing, and I hope that it saved you some money, or to the very least, it told you what you were actually getting yourself into if you do decide to pick it up. So do like and subscribe if you want to see more of this kind of stuff, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye now.